here?
Well, I'm curious. So New York State has sort of set out a plan to divest completely. Other cities, major cities, have done the same. Why are you not doing that?
Well, I mean, I think that is the direction we're headed in. And again, New York, no state has committed to a specific target by a specific time. New York State set out a goal that was a 30-year goal. Mm-hmm. That's the closest that any state has come, to my knowledge. I think Rhode Island is going to get there faster than 30 years, a lot faster. We're not going to turn on a dime. You can't do that when you're managing a $10 billion fund. But I would not be, as I said, my feeling is that with the trajectory that we have and the way things that are headed, we will get to zero within the next 10 years. I believe that. And the fact that we have gotten halfway there in 6.5 years, I think, is very exciting progress.
But we still have the pension fund still has major investments in the big fossil fuel companies like ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, the others.
Yeah. So again, when you're managing a $10 billion fund, you can't turn on a dime overnight. And there's a few reasons for that. Some of these funds that we're in have long-term lockups, right, where we're committed to stay in for a certain number of years contractually. There are also some funds that we're in that are sort of diversified, where legacy energy may be a small part of their portfolio, but they have other things that they do as well in the infrastructure space that we find more attractive. And so that's why it's complicated, and why no state not only has no state gotten to zero yet, but no state has even committed to a aggressive timeline to getting to zero. But the progress, I think everyone would agree, is impressive. I mean, to get halfway there in 6.5 years, and then to say, with confidence that I think we will be in zero within the next decade is, I think, a stronger trajectory and a stronger statement than any other state that I'm aware of. You're right that there are some smaller cities and that sort of thing, but when you're smaller, it's easier to move faster, right, and to make those kinds of changes. So, I think for a state pension fund like ours, we're on a faster trajectory than most.
There's a lot of local advocacy and national advocacy about getting divesting from banks that are heavily invested in pipelines and such like that. And how does that relate to this issue at all?
So when it comes to banks, our strategy has been one of engagement rather than divestment. So, as investors, we have the ability to vote on who the boards of directors are at those banks, and we have the ability to vote on their executive compensation plans, up or down. And so we've engaged with the banks in a number of ways, specifically on climate, through those methods.
Right.
Pushing JP Morgan, for example, to appoint a climate expert and remove a climate denier from their board of directors. We've encouraged all of the banks to measure and assess the risks of their fossil fuel exposure in their loan portfolio. So, there's a number of different tools in the toolbox to exert pressure on publicly traded companies.
Right.
And we have, with banks, been using some of the other tools in the toolbox, specifically on climate.
And this is the second or third divestment from, like you did the thing about guns previously, and now there's this one. Are there any other subject areas you think are worthy of that kind of attention?
Yeah, it's a good question. So you're right. About a year ago, we made the decision to divest entirely from companies that manufacture assault weapons for civilian use, and also companies that operate for-profit prisons.
Right.
Now on those, we were able to get to zero relatively quickly because they were a fairly small part of the portfolio to begin with. They were a fraction of a percent, right? So this is the third announcement in that vein. What I think we're going to do from here is look at doing a more comprehensive review of the entire pension fund and our exposure to environmental and social risks. That's a process that Andrew and I have talked about that I think will play out over the next year, and we'll see where it leads us. I don't want to prejudge what those results will be, but rather than just addressing issues as one-offs, I think the time has come to sort of take a comprehensive look at the environmental and social profile of how we invest, and see where recommendations come out of that. So I think that's the next step.
Cool, thank you.
All right, we have time for about one more question.
You mentioned exposure a couple times. Are you making this move because you think that fossil fuel companies are risky investments?
It's interesting. The way I would characterize it is, we make every individual investment decision based on the investment merits. And the investment merits have naturally led us to this place where our exposure has come down by half with further reductions to come. You know, the price of fossil fuels is much lower than it used to be. Demand for them is lower than it used to be. Alternatives are on the rise on a very rapid trajectory. Energy efficiency is on the rise. The technology is improving. So, you know, the way I would characterize it is investors have to be forward-looking, because when you make an investment, you are making a prediction about what future earnings are going to look like. And there's no question in my mind that the future economy is a cleaner economy that is not reliant on the large-scale utilization of fossil fuels. Like, that's the future, and we need to anticipate that as investors now. All right? Thank you, everybody.
I just have one more quick one. That's
Yeah,
all right.
sure.
I just wanna,
Yeah.
so getting from 37.5% to 50%, that's this divestment from MLPs,
Correct.
right? How did you get that 37.5%?
Yeah, it was a combination of things. We've always had a slice of the pension fund that was devoted to infrastructure funds generally, right? And when we took office, you know, a few years ago, that infrastructure bucket in the portfolio was very heavily tied to kind of legacy energy, fossil fuel energy, right? So, you know, production, transmission, servicing, etc., of fossil fuels. We've intentionally diversified away from that. So more of that infrastructure bucket now includes things like alternative energy, but also totally other types of infrastructure, right? You know, in some cases toll roads or, you know, water infrastructure or things like that. So a big part of how we got down to the 37.5 was by taking our infrastructure allocation and diversifying it away from legacy energy. And then, you know, also part of it is, you know, because the price of, you know, fossil fuels has come down over time due to less demand, naturally there were fewer attractive investments in that space to make. You know, every year, particularly in the private equity part of the portfolio, there's old investments that age out and we have to reinvest that money in new funds. And over time, we've been reinvesting less and less of it into, you know, conventional energy fund managers, just because the economics weren't as attractive. So again, like I'd say it was a series of individual decisions that were each made on the individual investment merits, but those investment merits naturally led us to this place, which is also why I have confidence that we will continue to go in that direction going forward. It's a long answer to a short question, but I appreciate it. All right, well, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you all.